The day after I buried my wife, my son looked me in the eye and asked me to sell the farm she'd spent 43 years building beside me. At the time, I thought grief was the hardest thing an old man could carry. I was wrong. 2 days later, standing alone in my barn at 2 o'clock in the morning, I found a letter Eleanor had hidden before she died. By sunrise, I understood that neither my son nor I had ever really known what she'd been protecting. Looking back now, I don't blame Daniel for what happened. The truth is, I gave him every reason to believe selling the farm was the only way to save me. I just didn't realize it then. If you've lived long enough, you learn that families rarely fall apart because one person stops loving the others. Most of the time, they fall apart because everyone is trying to protect something different. I was trying to protect a promise. My son was trying to protect his father. And Eleanor, she'd been protecting a secret neither of us knew existed. To understand how we almost lost everything, I have to take you back to an ordinary Tuesday morning in early October. The kind of morning that fools you into believing life will never change. The coffee on my porch had already gone cold by the time the sun climbed over the east field. A thin layer of mist drifted low across the pasture, soft enough to make the fences look like they were floating. The old grain silo let out its familiar as the wind shifted from the north, and somewhere down by Miller's Creek, a pair of crows were making more noise than seemed necessary. I'd heard those sounds almost every morning for over 40 years. I just never imagined there would come a day when hearing them would feel like a privilege instead of a routine. That's the strange thing about grief. It doesn't only make you miss the person you lost. It makes you notice everything they quietly carried through life without you ever realizing it. The porch felt bigger without Eleanor, not because it had changed, because silence takes up more room than conversation ever does. Her rocking chair still sat beside mine. I hadn't moved it, couldn't. Every evening for 43 years, she'd sat there with a blanket over her knees, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, because she'd always get distracted watching the sunset. She said sunsets deserved your full attention. Coffee could wait. Funny the things you remember. I can't remember what I had for breakfast the day before yesterday, but I can still hear her, because I planted tomatoes too close together back in the summer of 1988. They're going to choke each other, Harold. I know what I'm doing. She smiled. So do they. She usually was. Looking back now, I wish I'd told her that more often. People think 43 years of marriage teaches you how to avoid arguments. It doesn't. It teaches you which arguments don't matter. Eleanor and I bought that farm in the spring of 1978. We couldn't afford it. That should have been our first clue. The farmhouse leaned a little to the west. The roof leaked every time it rained. Half the fencing needed replacing. The barn doors barely closed. The banker actually asked us if we'd considered buying something smaller. Eleanor squeezed my hand under the desk. "We'll make it work." She said it with such certainty that I almost believed she already knew how. The truth is, she usually did. An old farmer named Gerald Pruitt sold us the place. On the day we signed the papers, he walked out into the east field, scooped up a handful of dirt, rubbed it between his fingers, and smiled. Best soil in the county. Then he looked straight at me. "If you take care of this land, it'll take care of your family." He, for a moment, before adding something I didn't understand until many years later. "But remember, the land isn't your inheritance. The people standing beside you are." At 27 years old, I thought he was talking like an old man. At 71, I realized he'd been talking like a wise one. Our first winter nearly sent us back to town. The furnace quit during the coldest week of January. The roof leaked into the bedroom. The pipes froze. We had $12 left after paying the mortgage. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Eleanor walked over, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. She slid one toward me. "We're still here." That became our family motto. When the well ran dry, "We're still here." when hail destroyed half a crop. We're still here. When the tractor engine blew halfway through harvest. We're still here. I thought she was talking about surviving. Looking back now, she was talking about staying together. The year Daniel was born, she insisted we plant an oak tree beside the porch. She was 8 months pregnant. I told her she should stay inside. She ignored me. She carried the shovel halfway across the yard before finally handing it to me. Then she sat in a lawn chair drinking lemonade while giving me instructions on how deep to dig. She called it helping. I called it supervision. Either way, that tree grew with our family. Daniel climbed it. Ben climbed it. 3 generations left their fingerprints on that bark. There are scratches in the trunk from pocket knives. Old initials carved where boys thought no one would notice. Every mark tells a story. The pond behind the house told stories too. That's where I taught Daniel to fish. Years later I taught Ben in the exact same spot. Neither one caught anything their first few mornings. Both wanted to quit. Eleanor kept packing peanut butter sandwiches and homemade cookies because she understood something I didn't. Children don't remember how many fish they caught. They remember who sat beside them while they waited. I still drive past the old feed store every now and then, not because I need feed anymore, because memories have a way of living in places. The building still smells like fresh-cut pine and motor oil. The younger men behind the counter don't know my name. The older ones still ask about Eleanor. I smile, tell them she's doing better than any of us. They smile back. Nobody says much after that. Age teaches you when silence is kinder than words. The next afternoon I heard Daniel's truck before I saw it. Parents know those sounds. His tires slowed on the gravel exactly the way they always did whenever something heavy sat on his heart. I was repairing a fence along the south pasture. Truth be told, the fence probably didn't need repairing. I just needed something to fix. Daniel climbed out of the truck carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one, didn't say anything. We stood there looking across the pasture. Finally he spoke. "Dad, I've been thinking. I figured. I worry about you." I drove another staple into the fence. "I know. You can't stay out here forever." I looked across the fields before answering. "Why not?" "Because you're alone." "I've been alone before. Not like this." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from worrying about someone who won't let you help. "I'm not asking you to forget Mum. I know. I'm asking you to think about what's best now. I'm standing in what's best." Dad, 40 acres, 1 man, 71 years old. It doesn't make sense anymore. My father stayed here until he was 83. He nodded. Grandpa wasn't grieving. That one found its mark. I turned away before he could see it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said the words fathers have probably been saying to their sons since the beginning of time. "I'll think about it." We both knew I wouldn't. He took a slow drink of his coffee. Then he looked across the property. "I love you." It caught me off guard. Daniel wasn't a man who said those words often. "I know. I mean it. I know. I don't want to lose you too." Those words stayed with me long after he'd driven away. Looking back now, that wasn't the voice of a man trying to sell a farm. It was the voice of a little boy who'd already buried his mother and couldn't bear the thought of burying his father. I just couldn't hear it then. I finished gathering my tools and started walking toward the barn. Halfway there I stopped. An elderly man stood beside the old red barn, grey wool coat, hands folded behind his back. He wasn't looking at the house. He wasn't looking at me. He was standing perfectly still, looking across the east field, as though he'd been there before. I raised my hand. He turned. Our eyes met. He gave me one slow nod. Not a greeting, not an apology, an acknowledgement. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees without saying a single word. I stood there long after he'd gone. Something deep inside me that the stranger hadn't come because of the farm. He'd come because of Eleanor. And before that week was over, I would discover that the woman I'd loved for 43 years had left behind one final gift. Not for me, for all of us. The next 3 days passed quietly, too quietly. Looking back now, I've learnt that the most dangerous storms are usually the ones that don't make any noise before they arrive. Every morning, I walked the fence line. Every afternoon, I fed the horses. Every evening, I sat on the porch in Eleanor's rocking chair after the sun disappeared. Not because I wanted to, because I didn't know what else to do. Grief has a way of turning habits into lifelines. On Friday afternoon, Daniel came back. This time, he wasn't alone. Emily climbed out of the passenger side carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. That was Emily. Whenever life became difficult, she cooked. I'd always admired that about her. She never tried to fix people's pain. She simply made sure they didn't have to face it on an empty stomach. "Hi, Harold." She smiled as she handed me the dish. "I figured you probably weren't cooking much." I smiled back. "You figured right." Inside, she placed the casserole on the kitchen counter, exactly where Eleanor used to put hers. For just a second, I forgot. I almost expected Eleanor to walk in from the garden, wipe her hands on her apron, and ask if anyone wanted sweet tea. Grief does that. It lets hope sneak in before reminding you why it shouldn't. Daniel carried a manila folder. He waited until we'd all sat down before sliding it across the kitchen table. "I need you to look at this." I didn't touch it. He opened it himself. Inside was an offer from a property development company. The number printed across the first page was larger than any number I'd ever seen attached to that farm. Enough money to buy a comfortable house in town. Enough money to pay for every medical bill I might ever face. Enough money to make almost anyone pause. Daniel watched my face carefully. "I know what this place means to you, but Dad, you don't have to carry it anymore." I looked down at the paperwork, then back at my son. "What makes you think it's something I'm carrying?" He hesitated. "Because every time I come out here, you look more tired." I almost answered. Instead, I folded the papers closed and slid them back across the table. Emily finally spoke. "We're not trying to replace Eleanor." Her voice was gentle. "We're trying to make sure you don't disappear after her." Nobody said anything for several seconds. The rain began tapping against the kitchen window. It sounded exactly like the rain Eleanor loved falling asleep to. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do. But this farm isn't for sale." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he was angry, because he was disappointed. "I was afraid you'd say that." After they left, the house felt even quieter than before. I carried my coffee out onto the porch. Rain drifted across the pasture in long grey curtains. The rocking chair beside mine sat empty. I'd spent 2 years pretending I was getting used to that empty chair. Truth was, I wasn't. You don't stop missing someone after 43 years together. You simply get better at carrying the weight. The next afternoon I drove to the cemetery. It had become part of my routine. 12 minutes down County Road 9, past the old Methodist church, past the grain elevator, past Hicks Hardware, or what used to be Hicks Hardware, before somebody decided the town needed another phone store more than it needed nails and lumber. Some changes make sense, some never do. Eleanor's grave rested beneath a young oak tree. She would have liked that. She always said people should be buried somewhere that still had birds. I sat in the damp grass beside her. Daniel brought an offer. The breeze moved gently through the leaves. It was a lot of money. I smiled. You would have laughed at how uncomfortable it made me. I reached down and pulled a weed from the edge of the stone, mostly to keep my hands busy. "You told me not to let this place become just another piece of land. I've tried, but lately I've started wondering if I understood what you meant." For the first time since she'd died, I admitted something out loud. "I'm tired, Elle. Not tired from working, tired from pretending, tired from answering every phone call with, 'I'm fine,' Tired from eating supper alone, tired from talking to a rocking chair. A crow landed nearby. It watched me quietly, almost patiently. I remembered something Eleanor had said just a few weeks before she went into the hospital. It came back so suddenly I could almost hear her voice. "Harold, have I ever told you about Samuel Brooks?" At the time I'd shaken my head. "No, he's helping me with something." "What?" She smiled. "The East Field. What about it?" "When it's time, you'll understand." I never asked again. Then she got sick. Hospital visits replaced conversations. Hope replaced planning. And eventually, hope ran out. Until that afternoon, I'd completely forgotten Samuel Brooks existed. As I stood to leave the cemetery, something told me forgetting him had been a mistake. Driving back toward the farm, I couldn't stop thinking about his name. Samuel Brooks. Why would Eleanor trust another man with something she never told me? The question stayed with me all the way home. As I turned onto the gravel lane, I saw him, the same man, standing beside the barn, exactly where he'd been before. He looked up as I stopped the truck. This time, he didn't walk away. I climbed out slowly. He waited. There was something about him that felt familiar. Not his face, his patience. People who carry bad news usually rush. People carrying the truth rarely do. "Mr. Carter." His voice was calm. "That's right. And you are?" He looked toward the east field before answering. "My name doesn't matter yet." I frowned. "I think it does." He smiled gently. Eleanor disagreed. The sound of her name caught me off guard. "You knew my wife?" "I did, for quite a long time." My heartbeat quickened. "Who are you?" He looked back across the field. "Has anyone told you what Eleanor was planning to do with this land?" I swallowed. "No, I didn't think so. You need to tell me." He looked at me with genuine kindness. "I will, but not today." My patience finally broke. "You've come here twice. You know my wife's name. You know something she never told me. And you're telling me to wait?" He nodded once. "Yes, because she asked me to." I stared at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. For one impossible second, I thought he was about to hand me whatever answer I'd been searching for. Instead, he pulled out an old photograph. He looked at it briefly, smiled to himself, then slipped it back into his pocket. "I'll see you soon, Harold." He turned and began walking toward the trees. I took 2 steps after him. "Wait." He stopped. Without turning around, he said something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "Your wife didn't leave you a farm." A long pause. "She left you a decision." Then he disappeared into the woods. I stood there in complete silence. The wind moved through the east field, the grain silo. And for the first time since Eleanor died, I realized there were still parts of her life I had never known. That night, sleep never came. I didn't sleep that night, not because I wasn't tired, because my mind refused to be. I lay in bed listening to the old farmhouse breathe. Every home has its own language if you've lived inside it long enough. The settling of the rafters, the creak in the hallway outside our bedroom, the loose shutter that knocked twice whenever the wind came from the north. Eleanor used to joke that the house talked more than I did. Looking back, she wasn't wrong. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending sleep was coming. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and walked across the yard toward the barn. The cold October air carried the smell of damp leaves and fresh earth. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once. Then everything became quiet again. The barn had always been my refuge. Whenever life became too loud, I came here. When crops failed, I came here. When Daniel left for college, I came here. When the doctor first told us Eleanor's illness wasn't something medicine could fix, I came here. Eleanor used to laugh and say I did my best praying inside that barn. I always told her I wasn't praying. Looking back, maybe I was. I pulled the chain hanging from the ceiling. The old light flickered twice before filling the room with its familiar yellow glow. Dust floated lazily through the air. The workbench stood exactly where I'd built it 30 years earlier. My father's hammer still hung on the wall. His measuring tape sat in the same drawer where he'd left it before he died. Some people inherit money. I inherited tools, and somehow that always felt richer. I walked toward the workbench. Then something caught my eye, the third floorboard from the east wall. I'd stepped over it thousands of times. It had always been slightly loose. I'd planned to fix it every winter for at least 10 years. Never did. Tonight, it looked different. Not broken, disturbed. The dust didn't match the rest of the floor. Someone had lifted it, carefully, recently. I knelt down, slipped an old flathead screwdriver beneath the edge. The board lifted easier than I expected. Underneath lay an old piece of canvas, tied with a faded rubber band. Inside, an envelope, white, perfectly dry, untouched by time. Across the front, one word, Harold. My breath caught. 43 years of marriage teaches you someone's handwriting the way music teaches you its melody. I'd have known those letters anywhere. I sat back on the floor. The envelope rested in my hands. For several minutes, I couldn't open it. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the realization that once I read whatever was inside, life would divide into two parts. Before Eleanor's letter, and after it. So I carried it back to the house, set it beside the coffee pot, started a fresh pot of coffee, then waited. Some things deserve daylight. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to reach the east field when I finally opened it. 3 pages. Every line written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. She'd even corrected one word halfway down the second page. I smiled. She edited grocery lists. Of course she edited goodbye letters. The first sentence broke me. Harold, if you're reading this, Samuel finally decided the time was right. She knew this day would come. She continued. I wanted to tell you everything myself. More than once I almost did. But I knew you. If I'd told you while I was alive, you would have spent our remaining time trying to solve a problem instead of simply sitting beside me. Tears blurred the page. I stopped reading. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't see. After a minute, I wiped my eyes and continued. 3 years earlier, Eleanor had quietly begun working with a conservation trust. Samuel Brooks had been helping her. Together they'd created a plan that would permanently protect the East Field from development. Not because she wanted to preserve dirt, because she wanted to preserve family. The easement would provide steady income, enough to protect the farm, enough that Daniel would never need to sell it to take care of me, enough that Ben might someday choose the farm instead of feeling trapped by it. Then I reached the part that hurt the most. I didn't tell Daniel because he sees the world differently than you do. When children grow up watching their parents struggle, they learn to believe money solves fear. Please don't blame him for that. We taught him. I stopped again. For years, I'd quietly blamed Daniel, not out loud, but in my heart. Eleanor had seen something I hadn't. Daniel wasn't chasing money. He was chasing security, for me. The last page was shorter. Don't keep this farm because I loved it. Keep it only if it still helps this family find its way back to each other. The land isn't the inheritance. Love is. I folded the letter carefully, sat there in complete silence. Outside, morning sunlight spread across the east field. For the first time since Eleanor died, the farm didn't feel empty. It felt alive. That afternoon I called Daniel. I need you to come over. He arrived less than an hour later. I handed him the letter without saying a word. He read every page, slowly, carefully. When he finished, he placed it back on the table. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "She knew." I nodded. She knew I'd try to sell it. She understood why. He looked at me. Then something happened I never expected. My son started, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a little boy trying not to. "I'm sorry, Dad." No. I reached across the table. I'm the one who's sorry. He looked confused. For what? For spending 2 years believing you wanted to take something away from me. I shook my head. You were trying to give me more time. He lowered his eyes. I didn't know how else to help. I know. Then he looked at me with the same frightened expression I'd seen when he was 8 years old, after getting lost at the county fair. I thought I was going to lose you too. Those words changed everything, because fathers sometimes forget something. Our children never stop being our children, no matter how old they become. Just then, someone knocked at the front door. I already knew who it was. Samuel Brooks had finally come to finish the story Eleanor had started. Samuel removed his coat before sitting down at our kitchen table. It struck me as such an ordinary thing. For 2 days I'd imagined him as the keeper of some impossible mystery. Instead, he was just an older man taking off a heavy coat after a long drive. Sometimes we turn people into symbols because we don't know them well enough to see they're simply human. He laid his worn leather satchel on the table. I suppose, he said with a small smile, it's finally time. Daniel and I sat opposite him. Neither of us spoke. Samuel carefully removed several folders. Some were county documents. Some contained maps of the farm. Others held letters Eleanor had written over several years. He rested one hand on the stack before looking at us. Your wife, he said quietly, was one of the most patient people I've ever met. I smiled without meaning to. That sounds like Eleanor. He nodded. Most families come to me after they're already in trouble. They're fighting. They're desperate. They need money. Eleanor came before any of that. He slid the oldest document toward me. She first contacted our office a little over 3 years ago. 3 years. That meant she'd started planning all of this before anyone knew she was seriously ill. Samuel seemed to read the question on my face. She wasn't planning for death, he smiled gently. She was planning for life after it. Those words settled heavily over the room. Daniel leaned forward. What exactly did she do? Samuel unfolded a large survey map of the property. The east field stretched across the paper in pale green. Your wife wanted this land protected permanently. Daniel frowned. Protected from what? From becoming just another subdivision. He looked toward me. Eleanor believed some things should belong to the next generation before they belonged to developers. I could almost hear her saying those words. Samuel continued. She worked with the Conservation Trust for almost 3 years. There were surveys, soil studies, county hearings, environmental reviews, legal agreements. She attended every meeting she was physically able to attend. He smiled. Even after chemotherapy. I closed my eyes. She never told me, not once. Not because she didn't trust me, because she'd promised herself something. She wanted our remaining time together to belong to us, not to paperwork. Samuel slid another document across the table. The conservation easement protects the east field forever. No commercial development, no housing estate, no industrial use. But, he looked at Daniel, it also provides annual income. Daniel looked surprised. Income? Samuel nodded. The trust purchases the development rights. The family keeps the land. The family farms the land. The family owns the land. But future development is permanently removed. He tapped the financial statement. The annual payments are adjusted over time. They'll continue for generations. Daniel picked up the papers. His eyes moved slowly across the figures. I watched something happen on my son's face. Not excitement, relief, pure relief. He looked at me. Dad, his voice broke. This is more than the developer offered. Samuel nodded. It always was. I looked down at Eleanor's letter lying beside my coffee cup. She hadn't simply saved the farm. She'd removed the reason to sell it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, rain drifted gently across the east field. Then Daniel quietly asked the question I'd been carrying myself. Why didn't she tell us? Samuel smiled. She answered that in one sentence. He reached into another folder, pulled out a page from Eleanor's notebook. He handed it to me. In Eleanor's handwriting were the words, "If Harold knows too soon, he'll spend our last years worrying instead of living." Beneath that, "If Daniel knows too soon, he'll try to solve tomorrow before learning to trust today." I couldn't stop staring at those words. She understood us both better than we understood ourselves. Samuel looked at Daniel. "Your mother never blamed you. She understood why you believed selling the farm was the safest choice." Daniel lowered his head. "I thought I was protecting Dad." "You were." Samuel smiled. "You simply didn't know there was another way." Daniel covered his face with both hands. For several moments, he couldn't speak. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "I spent 2 years thinking I was fighting Dad." He shook his head slowly. "I was really fighting my fear." The room became quiet again. Fear, that had always been the real enemy. Not money, not land, not grief. Fear. Fear of losing each other. Fear of being alone. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear had simply worn different faces. I looked across the table at my son. For the first time since Eleanor died, I saw him clearly. Not as the man asking me to sell my home, but as the little boy who used to wait on the porch every evening until my truck came over the hill. The little boy who slept on the floor beside Eleanor's hospital bed because he didn't want her to wake up alone. The little boy who had grown into a man carrying responsibilities he never asked for. "I owe you an apology." The words surprised even me. Daniel looked up. "No, I do." I leaned back in my chair. "I thought you wanted the farm. I never stopped to ask what you were really afraid of." He looked down at the table, then quietly answered, "I wasn't afraid of losing the farm." He swallowed hard. "I was afraid of losing my last parent." I felt something inside me finally give way. Not my pride, something deeper. Loneliness. For 2 years, I'd believed I was grieving alone. I wasn't. We all were, just differently. Just then the back door opened. Emily stepped inside carrying another casserole dish. She looked from Samuel to Daniel to me. Nobody said anything. She didn't need us to. She'd always been able to read a room. Slowly she set the dish on the counter. Then she smiled through tears. "I was hoping I'd find all of you together." Daniel stood, walked across the kitchen, wrapped his arms around her. She held him without saying a word. Some people heal families by speaking. Others heal them simply by staying. I looked out the kitchen window. The rain had stopped. For the first time in days, sunlight broke through the clouds and settled across the east field, the same field we'd nearly allowed fear to divide us over. Looking back now, I realize justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes justice looks like the truth arriving before it's too late. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone else was wrong. It's finally admitting that love had been trying to bring you back together all along. Spring arrived quietly that year, not all at once. Little by little, the mornings grew softer. The frost disappeared from the pasture. The robins returned before sunrise. And somehow, the farm didn't feel so empty anymore. 3 months after Samuel walked into my kitchen, the conservation papers were officially recorded at the county courthouse. The East Field would never become another neighborhood. No rows of identical houses, no concrete streets, no shopping center. Just open land. The same land Eleanor and I had walked across on the first evening we owned it. The same land where we'd dreamed about raising a family. The same land where we'd buried 3 old dogs, celebrated countless harvests, and watched more sunsets than I could ever remember. It wasn't just protected. It was finally understood. Daniel insisted on driving me home that afternoon. Neither of us talked much. We didn't need to. Some conversations continue long after the words have stopped. As we turned into the driveway, he shut off the truck, but didn't open the door. He just looked across the farm. "You know," he said quietly, "I almost robbed Ben of this." I looked over at him. "No, you almost robbed yourself." He smiled. "I guess that's true." Then he laughed. "So much worrying to poo." And Mum had already solved the problem. I laughed too. "That sounds like your mother. Some people spend their lives reacting to problems. Eleanor spent hers, quietly preparing for them." The following Saturday, Daniel showed up before sunrise, not because I asked him to, because he wanted to. The bed of his pickup was loaded with stone, lumber, and several trays of lavender plants. Figured your oak tree deserved some company. We spent the entire day building a small memorial garden beneath the tree Eleanor and I had planted the year Daniel was born. There was no blueprint, no measurements, no arguing over perfection. One of us picked up a stone, the other found where it belonged. Sometimes healing looks remarkably ordinary. By late afternoon the garden was finished. It wasn't perfectly round. One side leaned slightly. A few stones sat higher than the others. Daniel stepped back and folded his arms. Mum would have noticed every crooked piece. I smiled. She would have. And then she would have thanked us anyway. We both laughed. The sound drifted across the yard. For just a second, I could almost hear Eleanor laughing with us. Ben started coming out every weekend after that. At first it was only for an hour or two, then whole Saturdays. Eventually he started showing up, before I even finished breakfast. He never asked what needed doing. He simply grabbed a pair of gloves and waited. One morning we walked the fence line together, exactly the way my father and I had done, exactly the way Daniel and I once had. Some traditions survive because they're written down. Others survive because someone quietly chooses to repeat them. We stopped near the east field. I scooped up a handful of soil and placed it into Ben's hands. "What do you notice?" He studied it carefully. "It's darker than the other fields." "It is." He smelled it. "It smells different too." I smiled. "What does it smell like?" He thought for a long moment. Finally he shrugged. "I don't know." I looked across the pasture. "It smells like tomorrow." He frowned. "What does that mean?" I smiled. "It means somebody took care of it yesterday." He looked back down at the dirt. I could almost see the lesson settling inside him. Not completely, just enough. That's how wisdom works. It rarely arrives all at once. Later that afternoon we sat beneath the oak tree, eating sandwiches Emily had packed. Ben looked up into the branches. "Grandpa, yeah? Did Grandma know I'd grow up here?" I smiled. I don't think she knew. I think she hoped. He nodded thoughtfully. "I hope my kids get to see this place too." I looked across the farm, then back at my grandson. For the first time in a very long while, I believed they probably would. Summer arrived with long evenings and fields full of fireflies. The lavender around Eleanor's memorial bloomed exactly the way she'd always imagined. Every Saturday, Daniel and Ben came out to help. Sometimes we repaired fences. Sometimes we fished. Sometimes we did nothing more than sit on the porch with coffee, while the sun disappeared beyond the ridge. I'd spent 2 years believing silence meant loneliness. Eleanor would have smiled, knowing how wrong I was. Silence shared with people you love feels completely different. One evening, after Daniel and Ben had gone home, I carried my coffee onto the porch. The rocking chair beside mine still sat exactly where Eleanor had left it. I looked at it for a long time, then I smiled. "You were right again." The breeze stirred the lavender. The old grain silo answered with its familiar groan. For just a moment, the whole farm felt alive. Looking back now, I finally understand something that took me 71 years to learn. I thought Eleanor spent 43 years teaching me how to care for a farm. She didn't. She spent 43 years teaching me how to care for the people standing on it. The land was never the inheritance. The house wasn't either. Not even the money from the Conservation Trust. Those were only tools. The real inheritance was making sure my son knew he was loved. making sure my grandson always had somewhere that felt like home, making sure the next generation inherited not just property, but belonging. That's what Eleanor protected, and that's what she trusted me to finish. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Samuel had never come, if I'd never found that letter, if Daniel and I had continued believing the worst about each other. The truth is, we probably would have lost far more than a farm. We would have lost each other. Age has a way of teaching lessons pride never will. If you're fortunate enough to learn them before it's too late, hold on to them, because land can be sold, money can be spent, even houses eventually disappear. But a family that chooses to forgive can outlive all of them. These days, when the morning mist rolls across the east field and the grain silo sings to the wind, I still pour 2 cups of coffee. Old habits are hard to break. I drink one. The other sits beside Eleanor's chair until it grows cold. Some people might think that's foolish. Maybe it is. But love has never cared much about looking sensible. Every now and then, Ben asks why I always pour 2 cups. I just smile and tell him some people never really leave. They simply find quieter ways of staying with us. Looking across that field now, I don't see 40 acres of farmland. I see 43 years of ordinary moments that turned into an extraordinary life. A young couple with more hope than money, a little boy climbing an oak tree, a grandson learning to fish, a wife wise enough to protect tomorrow without stealing today, and an old man who finally understood that the greatest thing he could leave behind wasn't a farm. It was a family that had found its way back to one another. Some promises are made with words. The most important ones are kept with the way we choose to live after the people we love are gone. Sometimes home is simply the people who keep choosing each other again and again. The greatest inheritance isn't what you leave behind. It's the people who still choose each other after you're gone.